So as I was saying, there's those two modes of consciousness, and you could say the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere, they all have sort of characteristic traits. Now, I've noticed that the left hemisphere tends to look almost like an intellectual, if you so wish. It tends to be very wordy. It tends to be orientated in this type of way that is, you could say, even a little bit stiff. And maybe that's a mode of consciousness that shows up in quite a lot of intellectual and written works. Whereas there is also, and you understand it quite well, a different way that you can communicate. You can communicate without words, for example. You can paint pictures. You can look at something like music that talks in a weird way. Your body language talks and all these type of things. The right hemisphere tends to be an awful lot better with these. Not exclusive, but an awful lot better. Now, what you find interesting is that there's a style of writing known as poetry that is actually way more in alignment with the arts of painting than explaining, if you will. And so if I explain something to you, it's usually not very poetic. It's very practical, which is important. But if I speak to you in poetry or speak to you in this kind of colorful way, if you will, that hits your mind in an awful lot of has a different aura and power about it. And you could call this the mythopoetic mind, as they often talk about, or the part where maybe you dream or something like this. And so we know that these are separate faculties, and we understand the use and the abuse of both of them. But I started to notice that when I looked through certain people like Jung and Nietzsche, you'd look through, for example, Nietzsche's work, and there's a huge amount of his stuff that's very explainy, and he's an incredibly good writer, so he gets away with it. Like, he explains with style and even poetry, if you will. But Zarathustra stands out as something that it's almost like he just let go, and it was just completely the poetic mind that was ripping out of him completely. It was almost as if there's something else speaking through him. In fact, that's what he described it as. He said he was gifted that sort of bliss of inspiration. Jung himself, looking at Zarathustra, said, and we can talk about this if you so wish, that, oh my God, Nietzsche, it looks like Nietzsche had an archetype speaking through him, as Jung would say. Now, I'm not even sure if I like the way Jung does it, but nonetheless, it's you're kind of getting where you see where I'm getting at. This is sort of moving into this. Zarathustra is like a work where something was speaking through Nietzsche. And what I noticed is that it had an aura. Now, I'm a weird dude. Maybe I was taking a lot of LSD at the time, so I was kind of tuning into this stuff on a level that most people don't. But I noticed that it had that type of aura, like Genealogy of Morals, my favorite book by Nietzsche. And it's brilliant, but it didn't have that quite aura that Zarathustra had. Zarathustra was this grand story and dream. It was literally like a dream, if you want to think about it, just like you're seeing inside his head. And the same with Jung. Jung is a terrible writer. He's absolutely shocking to read. Like, it's just so boring and crap. Like, I would love to just fucking
footnotes alone. My God, I mean,
oh man, I'd love to give him a slap and be like, here, bro, come on, like, work on this. You're gonna be like well known, please. But yeah, he's very, very stiff. He's like slow, meandering. He's like a bit esoteric, very explainy, very left hemisphere, as I would say. But of course, the Red Book is like this massive schizophrenic break with all these flashy colors and pictures, and there's all these big breakings of narratives. Actually, I look at the Red Book by Jung, and it actually looks like the war between these two parts of his mind. You see these big, long, ranty, explaining passages that are like, my soul, and all this type of, right, whatever, Carl, like, just calm down. And then there's these bursts of literal narratives, like he talks to the devil, and he goes into some like castle where there's a princess, and he sneaks past the princess's dad and bangs her. Like, there's like all this crazy stuff going on that's very, I would say, like poetic, if you will.
He meets Elijah at one point in Salome.
Yes, it's just all that type of stuff. And this was the type of stuff that I tuned into. There was something about that hit me. It was like the part of our minds that dream. And when you see works manifest this way, they have a bigger impact. The Bible is full of stuff like this. And of course, the things like Paradise Lost and the things that stick out in the Western canon of having that type of poetic power. William Blake is another example of this. It's a slightly different style of creative, as opposed to, and you could say creative literature, as opposed to, say, the more explainy philosophy side of things, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. As I'm saying, it's practical, it has its uses, but for some reason it doesn't have that energetic power. It's like a language of symbols versus a language of language, and that was the sort of difference. So I sort of began there, and as I said, I ripped through all this type of stuff. I found the images very beautiful, but I didn't have a fucking clue what they were all about. And so that was the sort of beginning of, I guess you could say, my journey. I didn't even make that much of it. At that point, I just sort of dropped a lot of it and got into fighting and started to read my dreams because Jung told me to, and that sort of led me into more an extended part of training. But yeah, that was the sort of beginning of a lot of that stuff for me. So I don't know what type of foundation that paints, but yeah, if you have any thoughts, pop away.
Would you say that when you finally, and we have a similar journey, although I made the mistake of sticking it out to the master's level, and I studied Nietzsche intensively in grad school. But so do you think that when you did eventually go on to read, especially the Genealogy of Morals, and even the earlier works such as Twilight of Light Idols was later, but The Birth of Tragedy and so forth. Did you start to see sort of these pictures clicking in your mind of what Zarathustra was conveying in terms of honoring the earth and this mythos that Nietzsche was creating, that is an inverted mythos of what was the Western tradition before him? Did it start to sort of make sense to you? Because there, unfortunately, a lot of Nietzsche scholars nowadays, they almost like entirely bracket or discredit Zarathustra, and they're like, that's not important. But really, it's, come on, that's
really
the most important. Yeah.
I don't follow
Yeah, I
any
know.
of them,
The modern Nietzsche industry is kind of, he predicted it, by the way, the Nietzsche publishing industry. He hated that academicism around his work. So,
well, brother, I wait until I show you the Jungians. Carl will be twisting in his grave as well. But look, that's the way it works, isn't it? I'm sure. I wonder what Jesus would think about the Christians at the same time. So it's it's the way the game works. I think it's the way the game works. Wonder what the Fight Club people would think, or Tyler Durden would think of the Fight Club people. It's so me reading Genealogy of Morals, a lot of this stuff, and Nietzsche talked about this too, like a lot of this stuff didn't make sense to me until I lived a lot more. Like one of the most important things for me was going to do combat training, even trying sort of like, you could say more degenerate things like learn how to talk to girls and stuff like this. Like these type of things really opened me up to experiences like fear, like overcoming that type of stuff, really basic self-help stuff that you kind of hear about. Yeah. But that was all things that I would do. I go out and try to have a lot of experiences. I kind of try clash myself up against the world. And I guess one of the most important things for me, it was actually, I kind of alluded upon it, that idea of reading my dreams. It seems like the most ridiculous kind of like, why would you waste your time doing that fucking bullshit stuff? Like what were you up to? And it was a kind of bad idea in some sense, because I could have spent that time in my early 20s making money or something like this. But I go through reading my dreams. I develop this faculty. I go and I do public speaking. I go perform on stage. I go and learn to fight. I go and stand and take punches, step into the fear, all that type of stuff. Go talk to people, socially flower out and all this. And I'm then also doing this thing where I'm trying to, as you could say, read my dreams. And Jung just told me to do this. He said, I literally read like 4 lines, and Jung was like, you'll individuate faster if you read your dreams. I was like, all right, fuck it, Carl. Everything that you're writing is taking too long. So I'm just gonna go with this and try it. And from doing the dream reading, what I noticed is that it began to switch on. It's very, very strange. I don't know exactly why. I assume nowadays, and we can talk about some of the studies behind this, that the right hemisphere looks like during dreams, it's talking to the left hemisphere. I can explain that in more detail if you wish. But I assume that because I was reading the dreams for an extended period of time, I invoked some type of, I don't know, neurological connection in that regard. And I started to notice that I switched on this imagination of mine that I had very strong when I was a kid, and I sort of lost when I was a teen, as Lev was asking me there earlier. And when I got that part of myself switched on, it was like a fountain or a dream mind or something like this. All of these books began to click immediately after that, because it was like I was thinking a different way. I was thinking from a different perspective. I don't even know how to quite say it. It was like I was thinking in color as opposed to thinking in a flat way, if you wish. And then when I would look over what that's for example, when I'd look over Zarathustra and be like, fuck, that's what he's talking about. And when I'd read Nietzsche say stuff like God is dead, I started to understand that he wasn't like, what's his name, Christopher Hitchens or whatever it is, or even Jordan Peterson's kind of take on it, if you will. He was actually sort of suggesting that the fountain of creative dreaming energy in the Western psyche is dead, and it's not coming back in the way that you want it to.
The heliospheric picture of society and religiosity itself was dead, and that sort of like modernity came and vivisected us from those possibilities. Well, supposedly.
Is it similar to the NPC meme, you'd say, when it comes to somebody who was all grayed out in the beginning, and then there was another meme where a finger touched him, and then all of a sudden burst out all this light?
So actually, like, I think what you're just after saying there is a great way to illustrate it. So forgive me if I do tend to rant. So forgive me if I expand this one out. But what sort of happened to me is I was like, as a kid, I was like a delusional, on drugs all the time, running around drawing pictures. I had all these pictures of like crazy big realms of monsters and all these aliens and all this stuff. And then I go to school and I get, Prussian education system, conditioned, slammed into the books, learn these squiggly symbols, and the Broca's area swells in the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere dies off off, I kind of go quiet, and then it all dies out, and you get stuck into the grayscale way of living, and I'm getting conditioned to be an NPC in the world. And of course, I sort of turned into one in some sense. LSD kind of snaps that out of me a little bit, but it's not permanent. And then dreams come along, and they turn that back on again. Now, if I look over at, for example, art history, like the transition between Romanticism and Modernism, that actually looks so similar to that process. There was this innocence in Romanticism of like the cultural spirit was in a childlike state, even though it was sort of at its peak, if you will. It was nonetheless sort of innocent and very easy to imagine these big, Wagnerian scenes and all this type of stuff, or like all those really, really big European myths that are wrapped up in that. Irish nationalism was really tied up to romantic music. So we have Yeats and we have all those poets and all that type of stuff. Yeah. And Yeats himself, you see transitions when they go into modernity. It literally looks like that part of that whole mythopoetic thing gets pushed out of the way in favor of this very highly pragmatic style of thinking, intellectual style of thinking. Yeats starts writing political poems, and all of European culture gets obsessed about, the sort of intellectuals. You get people like Sartre and even Nietzsche showing up and all this type of stuff. And there's this, like, a lot of critical theory, a lot of this deconstructionism starting to pop up, and art starts to take this weird turn where it's more about shock factor as opposed to grandeur and beauty. And I noticed that a lot of the symbols sort of die. Things aren't as vivid and as big thinking anymore, if you know what I mean. And it does actually look like you shifting into that sort of, I would say, left hemisphere style of thinking. And I understand that as the God is dead experience in a, down to a phenomenological way, like that disappears out of our reality, disappears out of the culture, if you know what I mean. And then Nietzsche kind of pointing to that, saying, until that fountain is switched back on, we're going to be in some fucking crazy shit, guys. We're in for a wild couple of centuries, let's put it that way.